want to talk a little bit about the idea of personal responsibility and why that is such an important element of the freedom message. Now, there's a number of books that I've put out that you can download also in PDFs, or write me a letter and I'll send them to you. First one we did on the economics of freedom for American college students, and the morality of capitalism, which has come out in about 43 different languages, so you can practice your Urdu and Amharic and so on. The After the Welfare State, Why Liberty, Peace, Love, and Liberty, and the relationship between freedom of trade and peace. If you favor peace, free trade is the most important predictor of peaceful relations among nations. Then this most recent one on self-control or state control. So there's just a couple copies here, but write to me and I'll send you one, or you can Google it and download the PDF at zero price. Now, these are kind of snack boxes for the mind. We have a lot of big treatises out there that sit on our shelves and make us feel guilty for years on end. And I thought, I won't produce another one of those. I'll put together something that if you can pick it up and read one or two essays and you get something out of it, that's great. And I learned over the course of my life, some people will pick up a book and say there are no footnotes. It can't be true. So some of the essays have a lot of footnotes. And there are other people who don't like footnotes. So some of them have no footnotes. So there's something for everybody in these little books. Now, what I was interested in addressing this was, what's the demand for state power? We know there's a supply. People like to exercise power over other people. So the supply of state power seems to be fairly constant. What about the demand? Well, some people believe we need to have government because other people can't make good decisions. Usually they think they can make those good decisions. But there are even some people who think, I should not be trusted to make decisions about my own life. That's why we need government to guide us and direct us and so on. Now, if you think about supply and demand, the standard Marshallian cross with that magical little point in the middle where the two intersect, all it means is that at some price and some quantity, there's no one going out into the market trying to buy it at that price who can't find it, or trying to sell it at that price who cannot find a buyer for it. But we can think about the supply and demand of state power as well. And our typical approach has been to try to limit supply. We think about constitutionalism. In various countries with written constitutions, we think about the American Constitution or Canadian Constitution, explicit limits on their power, or Magna Carta. The king shall not do X, Y, and Z. This is a constitutional restraint. The idea is that we can reduce the amount supplied of state power by constraining the supply directly. And that's had some success. So we're always a little bit complaining, government's too big, but it could be a lot bigger. So we should be happy. That's had some success at limiting governmental power. Could be worse. But I thought we need to do something a little bit more and try to think about moving the demand curve in as well. That's another way to reduce the amount supplied of state power. Now, in doing that, we want to think about what is it that drives people to demand more government. And I'll tell you one thing, which I'll address in a moment. People make bad decisions in their lives. We know that. I actually made one once. It's true. It's true. In fact, I'm not perfect. I once made a mistake. I thought I had made an error, and in fact, I hadn't. We know that people make mistakes in their lives, and sometimes they screw their lives up as a consequence. And that leads to a demand for government to solve the problem. We can imagine a whole array of issues where there's that dynamic in play. Now, there's a very deep relationship between freedom on the one hand and personal responsibility. These two are actually very intimately connected, which is something old people have been telling teenagers for thousands of years. If you want more freedom, take responsibility. It's part of growing up. It's part of being an adult person to accept both freedom and responsibility at the same time. Now, the problem is, when you think of freedom in much of the world, not so much Australia, but in a lot of the rest of the world, and a little bit here, people think about irresponsibility, just partying all the time. I guess I do think of that in Australia, given the young folks last night, not thinking about tomorrow, having no commitments. Being free is not being committed to anything. You hear that, right? The freest person is the one who's not married, doesn't have property, and so on. That's a big mistake. Simply not true. They think of dissipation, selfishness, lawlessness, and generally out-of-control life. And in many languages, actually, the word liberty or freedom has been corrupted by those in power to mean out of control, or what we would call in English, license. The other problem is when we think of responsibility, what's the first thing that comes to most people's minds? Right? Old people scolding us. Be quiet. Shh. Stay out of my rose bushes. Keep off of my lawn. Right? So it seems to be a boring principle. Responsibility is boring. It's dull. But in fact, that's a big, big mistake. In fact, freedom and responsibility are very intimately entwined. If you want one, you do have to embrace the other at the same time. Hayek made this point so elegantly. Liberty not only means that the individual has both the opportunity and the burden of choice. Choice is not easy to make. It's costly and difficult for us to make choices. But it also means he must bear the consequences of his affairs, of his actions, and will receive praise or blame for them. Liberty and responsibility are inseparable. If you want to live a free life, you need to grasp your responsibility at the same time. Now, this idea goes back quite a long time. And here is the key that is missing in so much modern discourse. You sometimes hear a conservative friend say, responsibility is the price you pay for freedom. That's wrong. It's the reward. Responsibility is the reward for freedom, because you can say, I did that. We did this. We built this family. We raised these children. We started this business. I did this. If you're not responsible, you can't say that. Responsibility is the reward for a free life. Aristotle understood this very neatly, and those two important words, praise and blame, which are the markers of moral behavior. If you cannot be praised or blamed for something, it means you're not accountable. You didn't do it. Praise and blame are very important markers of moral behavior. Aristotle understood that so neatly in the Nicomachean Ethics, which remains one of the best books ever written on ethical behavior and how to lead a good life. Now, think about being able to say, I did this myself. When I read the two autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, themes that came through so strongly about what it meant to be a free person. As Douglass said, the slave cannot even say myself. Such a basic idea, myself, because that self was the property of another person who could even destroy him, kill him, beat him, rape, do terrible things to them because they didn't even own themselves. Nothing they did could be attributed to them, was their area of jurisdiction. And what Douglass wanted, he said, I want to be able to say myself. I do this, I choose, and I bear the consequences and reap the rewards or pay the costs of the choices that I make. Now again, let's go back to Hayek on this question. This thing I want to harp on a few times. All people are rational. Our economist friends like to say that. What does that mean? It's not the case that being rational means you always make the correct choices or the right choices or even the rational choices. The point of rationality is to deal with us as fallible beings and exhort us to do better. We don't start from the assumption that every choice you make is always the best choice. That's just wrong. And I've heard sometimes libertarian friends argue that. I say, we live on different planets. That's not true. That whatever choice someone makes is clearly the best choice for that person. We screw up. We make mistakes. It's responsibility that gives us the incentive to correct ourselves. Because we, to use the economics term, we internalize those externalities. We get the reward or the consequence of good or bad choices. So starting from the assumption that some people start with, that the individual always knows what's best for him or her, that's false. And all of us know it's not true. It's a very bad way to argue for liberty. The question is, what system of incentives or responsibility or allocation of responsibility will induce people to behave better, to live better lives? As Hayek put it, we assign responsibility to a man not in order to say that as he was, he might have acted differently, but in order to make him act differently. When I can dump trash on other people, I'm probably going to do it more than when they have a property right to exclude me. Property rights are one of the great mechanisms for helping people to act responsibly, with a concern for their own interests and the interests of those around us. There's a chapter in the book that I highly recommend by Lisa Conyers, and she looked at people in long-term dependency on the welfare state in America. And what did it mean? It meant they had lost their freedom, their control over their own lives. It's a very powerful chapter based on thousands of interviews with people in the welfare system or had recently left the welfare system and drawing implications for life in the welfare state. When your responsibility is removed from you, you also lose your control over your own life and your own freedom. Now, very important point. I'm going to dig down deep into some of the formulations we find libertarians articulating. This idea that we're just utility functions. We're undifferentiated calculating machines. We're agents who just always weigh and always choose the best things for us. It's not true. And it turns out people knew that a long time ago. Plato, not a friend of liberty by any means, but a quite serious thinker about the human condition, identified three parts of the soul, which he identified with the rational, the controlling one, that's the guy back there with the reins, and the appetitive and the emotional, or thumatic soul, the one that gets angry. And he said what we need to do is make sure that the horses are pulling in the right direction. Aristotle talked about the different functions of the soul. The nutritive function, which even plants have, plants and politicians and so on, the rational soul and the appetitive soul, the one that has appetites and desires. As it turns out, modern neurosciences have shown there's a lot to this. We identify the prefrontal cortex of the brain with rationality. So when you're about to do something crazy or angry or respond to an insult, and you hear your parents' voice in the back of your mind saying, take a deep breath, there's a very good reason for that. One, it lets you pause and think about the consequences of punching the other fellow in the nose. And two, it oxygenates the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which brings in your thinking about longer-term consequences. Because the lizard brain, when you're insulted, wants to punch him in the nose. And it's the prefrontal cortex that says, whoa, you might go to prison. Prison is a bad place. Do not do that. Think about the long-term consequences. What we need to do is manage our own souls and our own brains to become better able to make better choices for ourselves, our families, our communities, and all those around us. It's about learning to become more rational, not assuming we are as rational as we can be. There's a wonderful book by a Dutch a biologist, neurophysiologist with a somewhat unfortunate name in English. And he has pointed out that the brain is a series of elements that we need to help to coordinate together. And different parts of our souls or behavior can be rooted in different parts of the brain. We understand this so much better than we did in the past. Now, how can we increase our freedom? It's by exercising it. John Tierney, the New York Times, has pointed out it's like a muscle. Not exactly, it's not really a muscle, but the analogy is helpful. When we exercise self-control, we become better at it, better able to make choices for ourselves. And all the research in empirical psychology that's so supportive of the ideas of free and responsible individuals living together peacefully can help us to become better people, better citizens, better members of our families, better in business, better people generally. Now, it doesn't mean you become robotic And this is the mistake I think some people have articulated, that to be rational is like a robot. Not at all. What it means is being alert to the interests of other people and your own interests and thinking about them, being mindful. There's nothing robotic about that. You can still be loving, and you can be, in fact, careful about other people, but it's about learning to control our impulses to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And all those old-fashioned bourgeois virtues, like saving and thrift and thinking about the future, turns out those are parts of living a good life and something that we can and should cultivate. There's a wonderful book by Kelly McGonigal from Stanford University. I highly recommend this book. It's full of self-help tips on how to become a better person. And it turns out now we have all these wonderful things on our cell phones. I'll give you one example that helped me personally. It's called mint.com. I don't know if they sell it here in Australia also. When I get depressed, I buy stuff. I buy books. And I get a momentary rush of dopamine and I feel good. But it's not good for me. I have many tens of thousands of books in my house. I had to buy a house for my library. This is obsessive and wrong. And I realize I need to control that. And Mint.com alerts me. I set spending limits. And it alerts me because I connect it to my Amazon account. Jeff Bezos loves me. And it tells me, Tom, you're going over your limit. Stop. That's very helpful. There's all kinds of programs like that to help us to monitor our own behavior. Now, another hobby horse of mine, rugged individualism. I hate that term because it suggests to be an individualist you have to be rugged, like this flinty rancher here. But that's not true. You can be a dainty individualist. You can be a feminine individualist. There's nothing rugged about individualism. It just means being mindful of your interests, the interests of others, and taking responsibility. And dainty and feminine people do that just as well as rugged ranchers. Norbert Elias, someone I highly recommend, and I was turned on to him by Steven Pinker at Harvard University, points out, over the history of society, we have seen more complex social orders entail not more control by the state, but more self-control. He started his research in the 1920s looking, as a sociologist, at histories of etiquette books, books about proper behavior and how to sit up and where to place the fork and knife and so on. And the earliest ones said, do not these things, and they're really gross things. Like, as an example, it is unmeet to blow your nose on your hand and then shake hands with another. Okay. Do not spit across the dinner table. All right, check, got that. Do not reach into the bowl, gnaw on something, and put it back in the common bowl. Okay, I didn't do that. But it turns out that over time, as societies become more commercial and more complex and more free, those things drop out because people have internalized them. And etiquette books become more about where to put the fork, because we don't have to remind people not to spit over the dinner table. Right? There are other things we're concerned about. We internalize. As societies become freer, more self-control, more of that control is drawn inside the person. We need less of it externally. Freedom is not about living in isolation. It's learning to live with other people. That's what freedom is all about. And that means controlling our impulses, whether it's the impulse to hurt other people, to punch them in the nose when they insult us, or get in our way. It's controlling that internally, not relying on the policeman or the state. Now, the key element is the rule of law. Statists believe we need commands and controls, a proper ruler who will tell us what to do. But liberty is about the rule of law, or a law of rules. That is to say, we know what the rules are and we govern ourselves by them. Hayek did more than anyone to articulate this in such clear and accessible language, that it's commands versus rules. And we favor societies that are governed by rules. Now, I'll conclude with some thoughts. Are we just utility functions? And James Buchanan put it so neatly. We don't want freedom in order to maximize our utility. We want freedom to become the people we want to become. We're not just given bundles of impulses and desires, such that we try to find the production frontier and move out toward it, maximize our utility. We want to become the people we want to become, which sometimes means learning to desire different things. That's what is involved in growing as a person, to learn to change our desires and our impulses. Aristotle showed how to do that. The way that we become better people is by acting. Ethos in Greek can be translated not only as we do with ethics, but habit. It's about habituation. And we become better people by acting in better ways. And we do that when we put the control in ourselves, when we make the choice to become better people. So now's the time to take back our freedom. Now's the time to demand our personal responsibility for our lives. And that's what this really is about. I want to conclude with a personal message for the younger people in the audience, the people with all the energy and dynamism. I'm thinking of you, Ron Manners, when I think of that. And that is something I'd like to ask of you. What it is that we're counting on you to do. And that is to replace us. To replace us as advocates for liberty. Because it is very important to me and to other people of my generation that these ideas of freedom and responsibility not die with us, that they continue on. So I call on you to please, not immediately, but over the long term, replace us. Thank you very much for your time.